So here's some questions for you to think about. Why do so many diets fail? Why do communication techniques work beautifully for one person and terribly for another? Why do people buy self-help books, get excited, and then quit? Why do so many sales systems feel fake and exhausting? We live in an age where there are how-to instructions for almost everything. And yet, relationships still struggle, health still collapses, communication still breaks down, and people still feel overwhelmed. Why? Because most how-to advice assumes shared context that doesn't actually exist. I'll give you an example to explain what I'm talking about. When you consider how much you need to pay a college graduate versus paying a high school graduate, wouldn't it make sense for anything that a business could potentially teach with any level of efficiency to hire the high school graduate and pay less but get more out of them? I mean, generally there's an assumption that it's going to be a younger individual, could potentially be with the company longer, could produce loyalty because of hiring them when they were younger, when not as many people were interested in them. And so there's all sorts of upsides and all sorts of benefits that a business could get by hiring a less credentialed person and teaching them. But a business, most often, is wanting fast productivity, right? And you have to note that the college graduate isn't necessarily smarter in terms of raw IQ. The college graduate isn't inherently more capable, other than context. Because by the time a person has made it through college, there are thousands of assumptions that a business would no longer have to explain. It's that context, it's the assumptions, it's letting somebody else, i.e. the college, handle the establishing of a common context. So the hidden cost in life is not labor. The hidden cost is translating context. I'll give some examples from my own life to explain this. I tried running some businesses while I was in college. And as I tried to get those businesses going, one of the things that was hard for me, I'll be blunt, was sales. Marketing, persuasion, sales, getting people to be interested in buying whatever it was I had to offer. So I worked on learning sales, I worked on persuasion, how to have influence and communication, and yet something always felt missing. And I reached a point where I was just like, man, I guess just sales just doesn't work for me. There's just, I don't know, there's something wrong with me, I just can't do it. And then somebody recommended that I read the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And when I read that book, after I had already basically given up running those businesses that I was trying to do in college, I was like, wait a minute. Now if I'd known this, if I'd understood this context, all of those other trainings make sense now. So the sales training made sense, the assumptions underneath the sales training made sense. And the biggest thing is I'm like, oh, with this context, I could sell if I chose to. Because suddenly it wasn't an exercise in everything automatically failing. And so the thing I want to point out is so many times in the quick how-to, hey, here's the instructions, go do it, bam. Well, those instructions have assumptions behind them. So many of the people who are professionals in their field are professional and are excellent in their field because they have studied the foundational works. The deep works that, if you will, are the grandparents of the current self-help and how-to books. We're talking the foundational books that established it an industry or a space or a concept. And so those foundational books covered the key assumptions, and the later books feel, well, obviously anybody who wants to do this would have already read the foundational book. So I can just, pick up from that point. One of the toughest things as humans is to remember what it's like to not know. But because of that, later systems often assume foundational principles that weren't taught in their book, and unless the person has read the foundational book, they're going to miss those key assumptions, and by missing the key assumptions and key principles, the technique or the tool is not going to work as well as it could. And of course, then later for me, the huge breakthrough came when I first discovered personality science, because I had assumed previous to that most people were like me. I had assumed that most people thought like me. I had assumed that life was in general, that I had become, a decently normal adult, and this is what life is like, right? Well, that assumption made me very confused by what people chose to do. I thought we were operating from a shared context. And of course, there is components of life, there is components in any group that are truly shared. But the problem is when we assume that something is shared that is not shared, then we make mistakes, and key assumptions that we thought were going to work didn't work. And so once I learned about personality science, it changed my marriage, it changed how I led, dramatically changed my understanding of persuasion, it improved my communication. It is a big reason why eventually I chose to become a coach, to help other people improve all of these things. It was just an amazing thing for me to figure out through personality science that people are not failing because they're bad or they're dumb. They are just applying strategies built for a different personality, a different context, a different motivation, or a different system. That's why I went through the work to become a True Colors certified facilitator, so I could help people with this, so that I could help people improve their ability to communicate and to make things work. Let's deep dive just a little bit more on the essence of this and make it practical. So many people unconsciously believe that if this would motivate me, it should motivate you. But that's just not the reality, because people are fundamentally different. They have different talents, different capabilities, different understandings, and you just can't assume that there is some baseline normal that's going to motivate everybody. In sales training, in basic sales training, one of the concepts that people face is the concept of, I like you because I'm like you. So your traditional persuasion teaches find commonality, build trust, create rapport. And this works if that shared context happens to be there. But the great challenge is, so many times in our life, we need to persuade someone who is not exactly like us. Someone who is motivated by different things. And so when we don't have a context for understanding who they are and what motivates them, it makes persuasion more difficult, because it's kind of like target practice or shooting in the dark, or maybe we just try and hit all the motivational components and hope that they land. But the connection isn't there because we haven't truly gotten to the point of understanding the person that we're trying to persuade. So how do we change this? How do we move to a space where we can persuade others effectively? Well, ironically, the first step is to persuade ourselves. And to persuade ourselves, we need to understand ourselves. Because if we're trying to persuade others without understanding ourselves first, we're going to keep making assumptions. We're sometimes going to be confused by our own behaviors. And then it's very, very hard to feel the confidence in who we are so that we can accept others for who they are. Because if we start trying to persuade and someone has a radically different opinion or perspective than our own, and we're not confident in who we are, particularly if you're in business, but not even just in business, in families, it's the whole thing of, well, I really need to persuade them to do this. But if that other person has a very strong opinion, you start asking, well, do I just need to be more like them and things will be better? Do I just need to shift and change who I am in order to connect to them? And I would propose that you can flex into matching their energy, into finding the similarities, but it's important that you know who you are and you have the context of who you are so that you're coming from a place of confidence, not fear. Because before influencing others, you need to understand your motivations. You need to understand your fears. You need to understand your assumptions and understand your temperament. So how can you figure this out? Well, obviously, as a facilitator and coach, I'd be happy to help you in one of my programs to figure this out. But I expect, listening to this podcast, you might like some practical things that you can do on your own to start figuring these things out. And one of the simplest ways is to interview yourself, to ask yourself some questions. But to do this well, you would need to do it in a context of no self-judgment, no self-criticism. Interview yourself kindly, like you were an interviewer on a program who, frankly, if they are interviewing the candidate or interviewing a professional and they start ripping the professional apart, well, obviously, they're not going to get many professionals on their show. Same thing. So come in without self-judgment or criticism and interview yourself kindly. So when you've done something, ask yourself, why did I do that? And then get that response from yourself and say, okay, and why was that important to me? And why was that important to me? This technique is called the 5 whys. It's going 5 levels deep on asking yourself why, so that you can get past the surface and you can get to a place where you start understanding what fundamentally drives you. Because when you understand that, and when you choose to come to a place of accepting and liking yourself, not accepting just the surface answers that you feel like society is telling you, but truly coming to understand who you are, then you can come to a place of peace and confidence of who you are, so that you can then start seeing who others are without feeling threatened about your reality. So as you do this 5 whys exercise, you uncover your core motivations, your values, your emotional drivers, and your patterns. So true persuasion looks like you saying, why would this matter in their world? Not how do I make them want what I want? And this is the mistake that we make most commonly, most difficultly, frankly, in our families, particularly as parents. The whole thing of, well, I mean, this is my child. I've known them their whole life. You know, shouldn't they be somewhat motivated by me? I just got to figure out how to make them want what I want. But if we really want to start being persuasive, we need to understand and take that moment to say, why would this matter in their world? And of course, to do that, we have to be confident in who we are. But once we are confident in who we are and can accept who they are without feeling threatened by the differences, then we can say, okay, how would this matter in their world? One of the greatest sales trainers and persuaders, Ziglar, said, if you help enough people get what they want, you'll get what you want. But the challenge is so many people, they hear that and like, okay, I gotta get them stuff that they want. But particularly in the context of network marketing, or so many of the ways where that Zig Ziglar quote is used, people are like, yeah, I gotta find more people and help them get what I want. and see, that's where it breaks down. Because if you skip the listening part, if you assume that everybody wants what you want, then you're not helping them get what they want. You're wishing they would want what you want. And the key insight here is that people do things for their reasons, not yours. And so if you don't understand them, understand who they are, and understand their motivations, it's going to be really hard to motivate them, because you're just guessing and hoping that they're persuaded by what persuaded or persuades you. Let's look at it from the functional nutrition perspective for a moment. Most diets say, hey, remove the food, use discipline, suffer temporarily. And they have that pressure on of, hey, if you just exercise more discipline, if you're just more careful, that you'll lose the weight, you'll be better off, you'll have more energy. But they miss that food for people often represents pleasure, comfort, reward, and connection. Even on a physiological level, you have the dopamine hits and the beta endorphins. The reality is the food that people are eating does things for them. And it's not a question of just having more discipline. It's a question of, on an emotional level, what can we support? What can we bring in to help a person to move to a better, more sustainable way of life by building a context and a sensation of reward and enjoyment that's sustainable? Because here's the thing. A lot of us start out with diets or concepts like this, like, man, I just really, really want to lose the weight. But if someone came and asked you, all right, are you willing to feel miserable about food for 6 months so that you can be skinny? Well, if it was phrased that way, frankly, I think most people would say no. Because as they start the diet, they're underestimating how hard it was going to be or might be. They're underestimating what the food is doing for them emotionally. And Yes, they're underestimating their own discipline because, yes, they really, 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 really want to be skinnier. But they want to be skinnier in the context of the emotional support and joy and satisfaction that they feel today in what they're eating. Take that joy, that satisfaction, that dopamine, those beta endorphins off the table, and suddenly discipline is a lot harder. And this is scientifically proven through multiple studies, that discipline is an inexhaustible resource. And if you're not feeling replenished emotionally, it's going to be very, very hard to maintain that discipline. So in almost every area of life, what we're looking at is that sustainable change honors a person's core needs. It redirects desires. It integrates joy and creates alignment. Again, looking at an aligned life where you're in sync, where you're not fighting yourself. And that is as opposed to the most common types of change trying to push, which are demanding misery, forcing identity suppression, relying on willpower. And again, willpower is an inexhaustible resource. So that's why so many things fail, because it's not built in a context that is sustainable because of looking at the whole individual. Because the body is contextual too. And that's the other big thing, is realizing that context, even in health, tremendously matters, because with different contexts, the same supplement may help one person, it may do nothing for somebody else, and may even harm somebody else because of their toxic load, because of their genetics, because of stress in their life, because of deficiencies, because environments all matter. Context determines outcome. And so we really need to recognize that in all improvements, in all sustainable, in everything that you're trying to do to invite the best into your life, you have to recognize that your personal context matters, because you cannot force healing. You cannot force trust. You cannot force sustainable growth. You cannot force lasting transformation, but you can create conditions for success. You can provide resources. You can understand motivations. You can align systems, and you can remove barriers in a way that helps invite the best. But you can't force success, because the harder you try to force, the more resistance grows. So when people around you feel understood, safe, respected, and aligned, change and growth and progress feels natural. It becomes natural because we've created conditions for success, conditions for safety. A high-performance culture is often saying push harder, but sustainable transformation asks what is missing, what assumptions exist, what motivations matter, what resources are lacking, what system is creating this behavior. The big thing I want to leave you with in this episode is most things don't fail because people are incapable. Most things fail because context was missing, assumptions were invisible, motivations were misunderstood, and solutions were being forced instead of invited. And when we learn to understand ourselves, to understand others, to understand systems, to align with what matters and create a holistic perspective, we stop trying to force the transformation, and we begin to learn how to invite it. When we align change with what people truly value, transformation becomes sustainable. I'm Stanley Black, and this is the Invite the Best podcast.